All right, everyone. Thank you for joining our webinar today entitled Hispanic Voices. This is a comprehensive annual U.S. survey done by the Latino Public Opinion Forum in sponsorship with Adsmovil, FIU, the Adam Smith Center for Economic Freedom, and the Jack D. Gordon Institute for Public Policy. Our voices now today matter more than ever. Hispanics represent 19% of the market, but we also represent 18% of the electorate. So thanks for joining. My name is Maria Twina. I'm CMO of Adsmovil, and I'm super excited to have Dr. Eduardo Gamarra, esteemed academic and professor at FIU and the director of the Latino Public Forum, to share findings from the recent research conducted across the Hispanic market to better understand the attitudes, behaviors, and preferences of our U.S. Latino population. So just a quick word from our sponsor. We are a Hispanic-first digital media company. We drive brand resonance across the multi-generational Hispanic market. And what that means is that we have a deep understanding and discernment about the Hispanic consumer across generations, across acculturation levels, across linguistic proficiencies, et cetera. We have been in the marketplace for over 10 years. We actually pioneered Hispanic mobile advertising. We have a direct relationship with over 2,500 premium publishers. We reach over 65% of the total Hispanic digital population. We're minority owned and certified, delivering omni-channel solutions to better serve the cohort. We deliver data strategy, high impact opportunities, and we recently launched our new CTV, which is owned and operated, called Nuestra TV. Now, I know you're all excited about this presentation. We have a lot of interesting findings that Dr. Gamarra has uncovered. And just sharing some rules of engagement. We have so much data. I want to make sure we get through the data and have time for questions. So we ask everyone to kindly put their questions in the chat. We have an hour here, and I think we're going to take a good 45 minutes to sharing the research findings. After the presentation is over, we'll be sending out an email to all attendees, and we'll share the recorded webinar and the presentation if there's interest. So I'm going to turn it over to our presenter today, Dr. Gamarra.
Thank you so much, Maria. It's a real pleasure to be here this morning or this afternoon. I want to thank our sponsors, in particular Adsmovil, also the Adam Smith Center here at FIU, and the Jack Gordon Institute, our funders. This is an annual survey, as Maria has pointed out. The details of the survey are right here in this slide. This is a survey that we do annually. Generally, we try to focus on Hispanic voters in the United States. Our methodology, of course, is a CATI method. We use computer-assisted telephone interviews. The sample size is 1,221. And we, of course, are willing to share the data with you. The university requires that you give us your human subjects training before we can share the full database. But the database is available for academic use in particular. So let me begin. These are the characteristics of the sample. As you can see, we have a fairly educated group. We tried to get a broad stratification in terms of national origin. As most of you know, it's difficult to get national origin from voter rolls, so we identified national origin through the survey itself. The balance, of course, following the census, we've balanced the gender in accordance, and we have a fairly interesting division in terms of age, and then we conducted the survey in the states with the largest concentration of Hispanics in the United States. Those states, though, the ones where we really have focused the study, are these 12 states with the top concentration of Hispanic voters. As you can see to here, Massachusetts has 485,000 Hispanics who vote, and California has 8.5 million. And you can see on the left what percentage of Hispanics are eligible in each of those states, with New Mexico being the highest, yet New Mexico having a relatively small population of registered voters. So let me begin by going into some of the data that we have uncovered. This is sort of something that has been done now on a number of occasions, including our survey, but we've sort of been going into how do Hispanics self-identify, whether they prefer to be to self-identify as Hispanics, as Latinos, or as Latinx. And we are simply ratifying what a lot of surveys have said, that the preferred is Hispanic, second is Latino, and a very, very distant third is Latinx. And of course, this varies depending on gender and age and so on, but not by much. And the only group really where we find that there is some clear-cut identification with Latinx self-identification is with people who consider themselves LGTB or transgender. Now, so let me go very quickly into the data here. First and foremost, we asked the question, do you think the U.S. is headed in the right direction? And 52% of Hispanics, almost 53, consider that the U.S. is headed in the wrong direction. And only 35% believe that we're headed in the right direction. Now, when you break this down by state, it's rather fascinating to see, especially in the context of the 2024 elections, right? If you look, for example, at Florida, Florida has one of the highest numbers of people of Hispanics saying that the country is headed in the wrong direction, with Arizona being the highest of all, right? And of course, Arizona is a crucial state headed into the elections. But again, if you think about states that are solid blue like California, the number there is also extraordinarily high. But also, if you think about Nevada, Nevada is a state with a high concentration of Hispanic voters, and 76, almost 77% say that the country is headed in the wrong direction. Okay? Now, this is an open question that we asked. We asked, what is the principal threat to U.S. national security? And frankly, this is one area of great surprise. Perhaps it's the way in which the question was asked. Again, it's an open question. So, but we were rather surprised in some measure to find out that this Hispanic sample looks at open borders, at immigration as or unvetted immigrants, right, as being the most important national security threat. So this raises a number of different issues, especially related to the significance that immigration has taken in the campaign, and especially in the context of how the parties are approaching this, in particular the Republican Party and the Republican candidate. And here we've always said that this is not a new phenomenon in terms of how different immigrant groups react to their own compatriots coming in. We've referred to this often as the ladder theory of immigration, right? Where people are assuming that the boat is now full. Will the last person pull up the ladder? And we're beginning to see this probably more so in states that are border states, but it's also showing up dramatically in other places as well. And of course, this shows up even more dramatically when you do the crosstabs with by party, the Republicans much more so than Democrats. And then of course, if you look at this by national origin, even though here it's sort of an auto-categorized, but when you look at those born in the United States, versus those who are naturalized. And of course, Puerto Ricans who are born in the United States, but we understand the distinction. But here you can see that that this is something that cuts across all national origin groups, right? And then when you look at it by state, it's not surprising to see how, in those border states like New Mexico, this is certainly of concern, but also showing up rather dramatically in states in probably the experience of New York City. It's important to note, for example, that the mayor of New York, this as late as this morning, has been announcing changes to sanctuary cities. So clearly this is a major issue, and it is showing up even among Hispanic voters, right? Um, and finally, when you look at this in terms of what year they arrived in the United States, right? It's kind of an interesting thing as well. If we go with a ladder theory of immigration, then those who arrived earlier are probably those who are telling us that the border should be tightened, right? Uh, okay. Now, we also went into we tried to discern some areas where disinformation or misinformation is being produced, and with the idea that Hispanics are most susceptible to dis and misinformation. And so we asked this general question, and we worked this, by the way, with Dr. Scacco, Joshua Scacco at the University of South Florida, who's an expert on disinformation and is working closely with us. We asked the question, right, or we asked agreement with these statements, and it's interesting because again, the level of disagreement is higher than the level of agreement, but yet you find that there is almost a 30% level of agreement with this statement. And the same, if you break it down by party and so on, you can see the distinction clearly. Republicans are much more in favor of a stricter abortion policy than Democrats, and the same thing you can say about other issues. And now here's one of the interesting things that we found with abortion, right? And here I want to just simply point out that when we ask about abortion, we also we ask the question, what percentage of abortion is being conducted after 12 weeks? And it was rather fascinating to find out that very few people got the correct answer. The correct answer is 1%. Yet the overwhelming sense is that abortions can be performed even up to the day of birth, right? And but the correct answer is 1%, and we see in our sample that a few people got it right, but most did not. Okay. Now, another area of information or disinformation, and in fact, in Florida, in the last couple of weeks, it's become a very serious source of concern, especially with an outbreak of measles here in Broward, right? That we asked them, about which view comes closer to their perception of views about childhood vaccines, and while it's rather healthy that 70% agree with the idea that immunization protects children from disease, hospitalization, disability, and death, it's also kind of heartbreaking in some measure to those of us who believe in vaccines that almost 30% believe that either they have no significant positive effect, or that in fact vaccines expose children to disease. And so it's not surprising then that we're finding, imagine just 6% keeping their children from vaccinations. And this wasn't, this was a general question about vaccinations, not specifically about COVID, right? Which is where much of the controversy emerged. But in any event, we thought that it was an interesting set of responses, right? And you can the deck will be made available to you, so you'll be able to see some of this data in greater detail. Now, let's go more so into the political realm here. And so what I want to note that, this is we weighted this sample by party ID. And what you find, of course, is this rather interesting national figure, right, which coincides with other studies from Gallup, from Pew and others, right, that Hispanic voters are still largely registered as Democrats, right? 56% say that they are registered as Democrats, 26% identify as Republicans, and almost 15% identify as independent. Perhaps one of the most interesting things that we're finding is this move by Hispanics into the non-party affiliation category, right? Now, when we look at this by state, it's rather interesting, right? Because again, sort of predictably, you can see in the states where Republicans are making some significant gains. In Florida, for example, it is now established, and even in terms of the actual registration, not just our survey, that Republicans have now surpassed Democrats in terms of party identification among Hispanics, and certainly here in the county where I live, in Miami-Dade County, that is now the case. And statewide, of course, it has become the case as well. But you can see the national trend, and this is where, of course, I think much of the discussion today, both inside the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, is taking place. One, how to sustain those gains for the Republicans, and on the part of the Democrats, how to prevent this further bloodletting. Now, having said that, it's really quite interesting from our sample, because we find that just like Pew has found in their surveys, that Hispanics still believe that the political party that best represents their interests are the Democrats. And it's not by a little bit, but by a lot, right? So this we found to be really quite interesting, and perhaps because we all as humans live with contradictions. Well, some of the data down further along may tell you, well, this is contradictory. But what we're finding is, so they're Democrats, right? Majoritarily, they identify as Democrats. They believe the Democrats give them represent their views better, right? And but we also wanted to ask them whether in the last year they had considered switching political parties. And so this we found to be a rather interesting set of answers, right? That 71.4% told us that they had not, but 19% told us that they had, in fact, considered switching parties, with 9.2 saying that they didn't know or did not answer. But that 19.4 is a rather significant figure there. So if we go into that figure, that 19%, we asked them, so if you thought so, which best describes how you thought about switching parties? And within that group, 38% told us that they had thought about shifting from Democrat to Republican, right? 23% from Democratic to Independent, right? Which again, we think is a national phenomenon on both parties, by the way. And then 11% said from Republican to Democrat, or from Independent to Democrat, or from Republican to Independent, and so on. So this is an interesting slide and set of responses, because we're seeing it now. Just yesterday, for example, here in Florida, the voter registration statistics came out, And we did see an important shift of voters from Democrats to Republicans. So this is part of a national trend. How deep it goes, of course, we won't really know until a little bit later this year, right? Now, okay, now trying to explain what's going on, we of course asked several questions about institutions, about how about approval for institutions, right? And by the way, this is a worldwide trend, right? Where most people don't trust their politicians and don't trust where their politicians especially act, and that happens to be Congress. And so Congress, in our sample among Hispanics, only achieved a 32.1% rate of approval. This may be high in comparison to other samples that are out there, right? And in some, in fact, that took place over the last few years, the U.S. Congress went down into the teens in terms of approval. So maybe Hispanics are giving Congress a higher rate of approval than the general public. Okay. But of course, we also asked about the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court, again, which used to be sort of that bastion, right, of American democracy, today has now very low rates of approval, even among Hispanics. And in our surveys over the last decade or so, Hispanics were historically high on their approval of the U.S. justice system in comparison to approval abroad. But now it becomes very, very common, right, that the approval of U.S. institutions is not any different than the approval of similar institutions in Latin America, for example. Okay. Now, so remember, I said that, Democrats best represent the values of Hispanics. Well, we also said, well, which party best handles the following issues: education, economy, immigration, healthcare, and foreign policy? And it was, again, interesting to see how Hispanics give Democrats a very good rating, even on the economy in this particular sample, right? And so, and in particular, right, when you look at the two issues that are most important this electoral cycle, immigration and economy, right? Again, the Democratic Party rates fairly well. And on healthcare, we found it to be rather interesting. We've done the crosstabs, although they're not available in this presentation. But on healthcare, for example, we note some fascinating contradictions, right? And especially in places like Miami-Dade County, where some of the zip codes in Miami-Dade County, in Hialeah and Doral, have the highest rates of approval for former President Trump, but also the highest per capita rates of consumption of Obamacare, right? That contradiction, of course, is something that is interesting to try to explain, right? Now, we tried to get a sense of how Hispanics viewed themselves in terms of their values. Are they conservative or liberal? And what we found is a rather interesting description here of self classification of themselves. Most believe or report that they are middle of the road, right? With a small size saying that they are very conservative. More say they are very liberal than very conservative. And if you add the liberal with very liberal, you might say that Hispanics lean to the more liberal side of so let's say, middle of the road liberal rather than middle of the road conservative. So this is kind of an interesting table to take a look at, especially when we ask them, well, what do you think about capitalism, right? These ideas that we have that have become so central in terms of the messaging of political parties. And here we found something quite interesting, right? That again, they're middle of the road mostly, right? And they're rather neutral about capitalism, although, very positive to positive tells you that they have some quite positive views. They're more positive about capitalism than they are negative. So we wanted to go a little bit further into this because this is certainly, and the data will show you when you get it. But we also wanted to find out, given the fact that so much of the messaging has been about socialism, we wanted to find out also what Hispanics thought about socialism. And it was rather striking, in fact, to find this. And this is, by the way, the third year that we've asked the same question, and the results have not varied very much, right? And so you see that there's a good sample there, almost 30%, which is telling us that they have some positive views about socialism. We didn't ask them, of course, to define what they understand by socialism, but most are neutral. So again, from neutral to very positive, this coincides with their views about liberalism, right? Maybe they understand that Obamacare is part of that socialism, as Republicans label it. But if you look at the negative perceptions of socialism, they're not that different, in fact, from the negative perceptions about capitalism. So in any event, I think that this is, there's a lot of food for thought here about these perceptions of these two how should I put it, two ways of organizing society that seem to divide us so much electorally, right? Now, okay, so moving on, and we'll get back to politics in a moment. Let me, we tried to ask about, where people get their views, their news. And again, looking at other studies, trying to frame this in terms of other studies, it's very clear that Hispanics, like others, are primarily getting their news about politics primarily from the internet and social media. Television is still important, but look at the others, right? That are dropping considerably, newspapers and radio and so on, right? So this is we think important in terms of a number of things, not only in terms of the kinds of things that interest our friends at Adsmovil, but also in terms of how to message, how to reach this audience, this very large audience in the United States, right? Now, what is their social media choice? And here, these results, they've varied over the years, but Facebook is still important for Hispanics. If you go abroad, if you go into South America in particular, Facebook is still very key among Hispanics. But then you can see some of the others, and especially some of the new ones that are barely making a mark. But certainly Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok are making a mark. We asked about Twitter at X, right? Since that's the new name, but we've only labeled it here as Twitter, right? Okay, now let me get more so into the current 2024 context, the presidential elections. So we asked this group of voters, how likely are you to vote in the next presidential elections? And clearly 74% has told us that they intend to vote. Now, those of you who study politics and study elections and so on know that there's a wide difference between the intention to vote and the actual voter turnout. Hispanics, unfortunately, still have relatively low voter turnouts. And even though they register, that between registration and actually voting, there's still a gap. And that's, I think, a very significant job that is to be done there. It's not just getting people to register, but getting them to actually to vote. So having said that, let me get straight into the more interesting and curious results here. So we asked Hispanics, should Joe Biden run in 2024? And here we found that almost 35% say yes, Joe Biden should run, but 45% told us that no, Joe Biden should not run. And when you look at this by party, it's rather interesting to see, right? That among Republicans, clearly 75% say no, Joe Biden should not run. 13% tell us that they should. But what I found, and our team found very interesting, is that only about 51% of Democrats, right, say that Joe Biden should run for the presidency this year. Now, we asked the same question of Donald Trump, right? And here again, Hispanic voters, 57% told us that Donald Trump should not run for office, and 32.2 told us that he should, right? Now, when you break that down by party, you get an interesting contrast, right? More Republicans want Donald Trump to run, 70%, than Democrats want Joe Biden to run, right? And this is perhaps, it tells you a little bit about the nature of the phenomenon, right? That Trump has become within the Republican Party, or at least within a segment of the Republican Party, right? Again, you'll be able to see the breakdown by gender and so on, and age when you get the full deck, right? Now, so then having said, okay, so you don't want these two men to run, right? So if the elections were held today, for whom would you vote? And here it's interesting again, right? And it sort of reveals the pattern of party identification, right? 53% said they would vote for Joe Biden, and 33.2% say that they would vote for Donald Trump. Now, I remind you that this is a sample that is weighted by party ID. So we probably are looking at a figure that's between 33 and 36%, which coincides with other studies, right? Now, having said that, when you break this down, it's rather interesting to see again by party. You'll see in the breakdown that clearly the figure changes dramatically when you ask by political party. Now, having said that, and I promise I'll get you that particular slide, and I'll include it in the deck. But let me emphasize one thing here about the presidential vote in 2024. What our study is telling us, especially when you break this down by state, is that especially in key states that are where the Republicans appear to be making gains, right? Like Arizona, like Georgia, and so on, that a shift of 2 to 4% could be very strongly in favor of Donald Trump come November, right? Nationally, many studies, many of my colleagues coincide that if Hispanics achieve about 36% of the national Hispanic vote, that would be extraordinarily favorable for a Donald Trump victory. And so this is why I think in part these studies are important to kind of project where this population is going, and perhaps lead to some responses or actions, right? Okay, so let me shift this very quickly because I do want to leave time for questions and answers, right? We wanted to also explore foreign policy. Because foreign policy has become such an enormous dimension of how of at least how Latinos are looking at things. And mind you, we've asked this question over many years, but this year we really got a very high response on the extremely important or very important, right? A decade ago, for example, this figure was very low, right? Where Hispanics didn't really seem to think that in their decision to vote, right, that foreign policy was that significant. But today, if you look at this, it tells you that, somewhere between somewhat important and extremely important is almost the entire sample, right? And so what are the issues, right? I think in particular, I think it's immigration, which is obviously it's an intermestic issue. It's an international issue, but it's a domestic issue, and it appears to affect us all, but especially Hispanics, right? Now, we also tried to go into what they think of of extra hemispheric actors like China, Russia, and Iran. And so we gave them some options, right? So, and we gave them the strategic denial option, which is, to do our best to keep these countries out of our hemisphere. And there was greater agreement with that. Promote U.S. investment to compete with these powers, about 30%. And then, 18% says that we should step aside and not worry too much, I guess, about it. But I was interested in the results of what Lars Schultz from the University of North Carolina called strategic denial. In other words, do our best. We have done this historically, right? This is a Monroe Doctrine question. Let's keep the foreign powers from our hemisphere, right? And we also asked about U.S. policy toward Cuba, right? What is U.S. policy toward Cuba? Uh, and again, we didn't tell them U.S. policy towards Cuba includes the following. So this was kind of a question that basically required agreement or disagreement. And again, smack in the middle with stronger levels of agreement than with disagreement. But 15% saying that they don't know what the policy is. And we asked the same thing about Venezuela, right? And again here, right, with 15% telling us that they don't know, but the level of disagreement is fairly low, and the level of agreement is much higher. Again, I'm always caught for an explanation to trying to understand what U.S. policy is toward Venezuela. So our respondents, of course, didn't have specifics either. Okay, so that is the presentation. Again, I want to thank our sponsors for working with us on this survey, and I'm open to any questions, suggestions, and criticisms that you might have. Thank you.
Thank you, Eduardo. Great job. We have some questions already, so I'll take those. I'll take additional questions. We have 7 questions, so hopefully we can get through all of these. The first one is, what is the language stratification of the sample, or what percent was Spanish monolingual, bilingual, and or English monolingual, and what percent completed the interviews in Spanish? This is from Ernest. Eduardo?
Yeah, a good question. The survey was offered in both languages, right? And about 83% of the sample was completed in English. We had roughly about the remainder answered the questionnaire in Spanish. Okay.
Great, thank you. Another question, has the Democratic to independent change increased from the last election? And if so, by how much?
Yeah, it's increased at about 4 percentage points from our last survey. Okay. And also if you look at it in terms of electoral results in 2020, that's what the change is. So again, if you break this down by state, the change is more significant in Florida in particular. But nationally, right, there isn't this enormous shift of Democrats over to the Republican Party that in some places you might hear, right? There is a trend, but it's not a national bloodletting. There are certain states that we've been able, where the survey was conducted, where this trend is more evident. It looks like it's more evident in Arizona, in Nevada, in Texas, and Florida, for example.
Great, thank you. A question from Laura regarding the Democratic handling of issues. Do we have results by state?
Yes, we have results by state, but they're not in this presentation. And if you email me or email us, I would be glad to share them with you. Okay.
Thank you. We have a couple more. What are Latinos' views on fascism, especially among Latinos in Florida? Interesting question.
Well, that's a great question that we need to ask in the future, right? Because I mean, look, the reality is that there's these are very heavy questions to ask in a survey, especially when you
Yeah.
don't define what capitalism is or what socialism is. But especially when the messaging, especially here in South Florida, has been so absolutely, overwhelming, right? And it is now national messaging targeting specifically Hispanics, right? I think it's important to understand that we're talking about populations, especially here in Florida, but elsewhere as well, that have fled countries that claim to be either socialist or claim to be even progressive, right? And we've also found that messaging is effective, right? That messaging appears to be effective in terms of how people either decide to leave the party or then subsequently vote, right? Now, how long that's going to last, right? Are those shifts permanent? Right? I think that you can only measure that over the long term. But right now, as we see it, especially in communities like ours here in South Florida, right? That messaging has been very significant. But it's not the only part of the equation. I think that there's also, I think you also have to look at the relentless campaign that Republicans have had, right? And this, and by relentless, I'm not putting a negative aspersion on it. In fact, I think Democrats should be more relentless as well, right? Because Republicans have a permanent campaign. Democrats have been a little bit more on the let us say intermittent campaigns. And so, especially when it comes to these issues, right, the messaging about socialism has been extraordinarily important. Uh, there is a misunderstanding, obviously, about what fascism is, and you hear all the time, these connections between socialism and fascism, and capitalism and fascism. But it's hard to ask that question. I guarantee you that maybe we will include it in the next version, right? Because I think we're probably going to get high negatives on both sides, right?
Great. All right, we have another question from Robin. Do you know what information Hispanics seek to know more about state or local elections, especially when it comes to voting access?
That's a good question. What information do they seek? Are you asking where they seek it, or what specific kind of information they're asking? I guess that's an important distinction. Um, how they access information, I think, is important, and we've asked that question, right? Where they get it, where Hispanics get most of their information, their political information. Social media is number one, right? But when you do crosstabs, for example, on that specific question, we find a very interesting thing where, for example, there are some places in the United States for Hispanics where radio is still extraordinarily important, right? And again, looking at it from large urban areas, Los Angeles, Miami, and so on, Houston, where Hispanic radio is very important, and where radio hosts are extraordinarily important in terms of, let me use the term of guiding voters, right? The political discussions that take place on radio are extraordinarily important in terms of getting the kind of information to voters. And so, you can look at it in one of two ways. One, that's very positive because voters are accessing information via radio, right? Not just the internet and social media. But at the same time, in highly politicized environments like South Florida, right? Where you have our radios in the morning are, let us say, more liberal than in the afternoon, right? You have a breakdown of the audience there that's really significant, and where I think radio becomes part of the mainstreaming of disinformation in particular.
Great, thank you. Another question from Christian. Is this the first time you've asked questions about capitalism and socialism? Are there discernible trends or changes in sentiment, and are crosstabs to look at nationality available for that?
Yes, we have the crosstabs on this, and again, we'd be glad to share them if you write us or call us. Um, we've asked this question now 3 years running, right? And the results don't vary very much. Okay, it really is quite striking. In fact, in last year's version, right, there was quite a lot of controversy over those results because again, how could anybody be against capitalism in the highly politicized environment that we live in, right? So we have 3 years, right? And we're going to continue to ask this question and see whether it varies in the course of the electoral process.
Great, thanks, Eduardo. And let me just throw in here now that please send any questions to marketing@adsmovil.com, and we'll make sure that you get your answers or your request answered. Another question from Robin: what misinformation and disinformation needs to be addressed or answered for Hispanics during election season?
Thank you, Robin, for your question. I think we have, and by the way, there are an awful lot of very good studies now on disinformation and misinformation that are out there. There's, I urge you, for example, to contact Evelyn Perez, who actually helped us with the crafting of some of these questions from We Are Más. Also, Roberta Braga at DDIA in DC, who has a wonderful set of studies now on disinformation. So, but what are we particularly concerned about? I mentioned obviously the vaccination issue, right? Which now, in the context of Florida, right, we just had an outbreak here, right, and our principal health authority in the state essentially responded by letting, it's up to the parents to decide whether their kids kids with measles should go to school or not. I think there's an awful lot. There continues to be disinformation about vaccines overall, right? The rejection of science, and as I noted, and this, of course, from my colleague at the University of South Florida, Joshua Scacco, right? It's fine that 70% of Hispanics. It's good that 70% of Hispanics think that vaccines are a good thing, but it doesn't take very many people to not vaccinate their children to have a major public policy impact. So vaccines are a very significant part of the disinformation campaign. There's also, of course, disinformation related to issues, well, abortion in particular, right? When you track these kinds of things, we see especially this idea that abortions after 12 weeks are really the majority, right? And that even to the time of birth, right? And when the data are very clear, right, that abortions do not occur mainly after 12 weeks. So on abortion, there is a significant amount of mis and disinformation that continues to happen. But we also have mis and disinformation related to immigration, right? Um, this is a phenomenon that we've studied elsewhere, not just in the United States, but elsewhere when it comes to, for example, security issues, right? You can have enormous successes in reducing crime, for example, but all it takes is one particular incident for everything to kind of go flying out the door, right? With respect to progress on crime. One murder of a prominent person is enough to really generate some very very difficult national sentiment. And as we're seeing, over the course of the last weeks with migrants in New York, and now the horrible murder in Georgia, right, and the national impact that that's having. So, you know, we all know logically that that's an exceptional case, right? That most Venezuelan immigrants are not going around doing that. But when you listen to some of the radios and the coverage that this has gotten, you would assume that every Venezuelan immigrant is a criminal, right? And by the way, this is not just in the United States. We're seeing it in Peru, we're seeing it in Chile, we're seeing it in Colombia, we're seeing it everywhere, right? So I think it's important to track how information on these key issues, especially in the electoral context, is being divulged, right? And who divulges, and it's important to respond to it. And then, of course, we've asked this question in other studies, but certainly, the election deniers, right? The fraud questions. We're starting another study on fraud, international fraud, and putting the U.S. in a comparative perspective there, and we're seeing that phenomenon as well. That large amounts of disinformation on in terms of elections. Okay.
Thanks, Eduardo. A couple of other questions from Joe. What can both presidential campaigns do better to win over Latino voters? Also, when you say social media is a main source for news, did you drill down to say what is the original source of the material being shared on social, i.e. traditional media outlets, et cetera? So are they repurposing or resharing content from a traditional media outlet? Did we dive into that or just say social media in general?
We just said social media
Yeah.
in general, Joe, and again, there are a number of different studies on that I can point you to. But again, as Maria knows, the study as is huge, and it's just hard to try to include more questions and to drill down. But it's a good suggestion for us to do in the next round.
Yes, for sure. Another question from Nicole, going back to the slides that you mentioned overlapped with misinformation, the one on views on abortion, for example. Did researchers get any insight into how the views of Hispanics are shaped? If they are more based on media they consume, or more based on upbringing and personal experiences? Interesting question.
Nicole, that is a fascinating
Yeah,
question. I think we really need to do some serious qualitative work on that, right? Because
yeah.
I think we could probably, get to it a little bit more doing some more statistical analysis. But I think that your question is really a very good question for a focus group, right? And because that really is a fascinating question. Well, again, thank you. As a suggestion, we'll keep that one in mind for a long time.
Okay, and we have one final question, and I think we got through all of them. By the way, I just have to say that I feel like I'm back in college whenever you're talking, Dr. Gomara. So thank you so much. Make me feel young again. All right, one more final question. Is there a distinction about fascism associated with communism, socialism among Venezuelans and Nicaraguans versus Trump's based brand of fascism, which I think is viewed as a capitalist version of fascism? And could this explain why older Cubans, Venezuelans, and Nicaraguans seem to gravitate towards Trump despite his fascist autocrat rhetoric? This needs to be explored. Great question. Interesting thoughts on that?
Yeah, it needs to be explored.
Yeah,
But we've done the crosstabs, right, by party. We've done the parties, but we've done the crosstabs by all of the demographic variables and so on, and we can do others, right? But it's really, especially with things being so fluid right now, right, and so intensely fluid, right? But we've done other studies on specifically on Venezuelans in South Florida. We've done, it's good opportunity to plug our annual study on Cubans, for example, right? So we have 30 years of data on how Cubans see a number of different issues. Cuban Americans see a number of different issues. So one of the things that we do know, from plugging the work of my colleagues here at FIU, Guillermo Grenier in particular, right, is that we see these enormous flows of public opinion, right? These are not static views. We're living a particular moment, but these views are not going to be static over time, right? And it really, context does matter. And certainly what matters is who's running for office. And I think we are living in a very interesting times with at least some very interesting candidates who shape how people think. But it's also a product of their historical experience when they arrived in the United States, right? That certainly is a major component to how people think, right? And we have the waves now of immigrants on Venezuelans as well, right? And so we are able to do those generational kinds of studies and to look at how different waves where they fall on these particular questions. So your question is a very interesting one, and I don't have a very clear answer, I'm afraid, but the data are there. Okay?
Right. And we have another question here. I know from Juan Carlos, I know that this is not part of the study, but how do churches within Hispanic communities navigate their role in the political arena? A great question.
Juan Carlos, we actually asked the religion question, and we have some crosstabs on religion. Okay, and what we do see it is very interesting, right? The importance of evangelism, right?
Hmm.
Hispanic community. And in fact, uh, if you allow me, there's some very interesting recent studies on evangelical movements in the United States, and some that came out in some very good piece. I can't remember which major news outlet, but it's really fascinating to what their conclusion is, that evangelicals down the road, right? We often associate evangelism with white Americans, right? But this study tells us that uh, in a very short period of time, evangelicals are primarily going to be Hispanics and other minorities, right? And we are, of course, seeing this now, and we can see it in the data, and we can see how identifying as evangelical coincides with being more conservative than liberal, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, wonderful. Well, we are actually right at time, so this couldn't have worked out better. Thank you, Dr. Gamara. As always, greatly appreciate not only your wisdom and intellect, but your understanding of this market across acculturation. So thank you for your time, and thank you to all participants for joining. Again, just email us at marketing@Adsmovil with any additional questions, and we will be following up with all attendees and sending over the recorded webinar as well as the presentation. So thank you and have a great day. Thank you for joining.
Well, thank you, Maria.